Close your eyes and imagine a world without maps. Not a world that hasn't been drawn yet, but a world where the drawing itself is the act of imagination. Where cartographers placed sea monsters at the edges not because they believed in them, but because the unknown deserved a symbol, and fear was the most honest one they had. In the 13th century, Europe was a continent that knew itself and very little else. The Mediterranean was familiar water. The Holy Land was a wound that never quite closed. But beyond the great mountain ranges of Central Asia, beyond the deserts that swallowed caravans whole, there existed a civilization so vast, so populated, that when a young Venetian merchant finally returned home and began to speak of it, his own people decided he must be lying. His name was Marco Polo. He was born in Venice around the year 254, into a family of traders who understood that wealth moved along invisible lines between cities, that the silk on a noblewoman's back Florence had once been thread in the hands of a weaver 10,000 miles away. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo were not men of poetry. They were men of ledgers and roads. And they had already traveled east once before Marco was old enough to remember their faces. When they returned, Marco was 15, and within 2 years they were preparing to leave again, this time taking the boy with them. We do not know exactly what Marco felt on the morning they departed Venice. We know the canals would have been cold, the air sharp with brine and the distant smell of smoke from the glassblowers' furnaces on Murano. We know the city behind him was the most beautiful in the world, by his own people's reckoning. And we know he would not see it again for 24 years. The road east was not a single road. It was a network of paths worn into the earth by centuries of merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and nomads. The Silk Road was not silk, and it was one road. It was mud and stone and sand and ice, changing with the season, dangerous at every turn, and profoundly, etchingly alive with the movement of human beings carrying things from one end of the world to the other. Marco, Niccolo, and Maffeo traveled through Armenia, through Persia, through the high cold plateaus of what is now Afghanistan. Marco fell ill somewhere in the mountains and they rested for a year, waiting for his body to recover its strength. The altitude had crushed something in his lungs, or so the historical record implies. He did not write about the fear of dying from home. He was not kind of writer. They crossed the Pamir Mountains, what Marco called the roof of the world, and the description he left behind is one of the great pieces of travel writing in human history. Though he did not know he was writing history, he described the air as so thin that fire would not burn properly, that the cold was unlike any cold he had known, that the plateau stretched so wide and so high that it seemed to belong to a sky rather than a land. No birds flew there, no warmth reached there, and yet, he wrote, the place had a strange, austere beauty that he could not explain. This is the first place where we begin to understand something important about Marco Polo's relationship with truth. He was not a man who embellished out of vanity. He was a man who described what he saw with the vocabulary available to him. And sometimes that vocabulary was insufficient. When he encountered things for which Venice had no word, he reached for the nearest approximation. When he saw things that had no European equivalent, he compared them to something smaller, something familiar, and the comparison inevitably diminished what he was describing. And then, sometimes he made mistakes. He reported things he had heard rather than seen. He included stories passed to him by merchants along the road, stories that may have been true, or may have been the accumulated mythologies of the trade routes. Tales polished smooth by 1,000 tellings, until they no longer resembled their origins. This is not lying, but it is the beginning of an answer. They arrived of Kublai Khan in 275, after approximately 3.5 years of travel. Marco was 21 years old. There is a moment in his account. We call the book The Travels of Marco Polo, though he called it Il Million, the million, a nickname that would later be used to mock him. There is a moment when he first describes the Sans Palace at Xanadu, and the writing changes. Something loosens. The careful merchant's eye, which had been cataloguing goods and distances and trade routes, suddenly becomes something else. It becomes the eye of a man who has been struck dumb by beauty, and is trying, imperfectly, to translate the experience into words for people who will never stand where he stood. Xanadu, in the Chinese records, was a city of such deliberate magnificence that it seemed designed not merely as a residence, but as a philosophical statement. The Khan wished to demonstrate that the world had a center, and that he was it. The palace grounds contained a vast deer park. Rivers were redirected to fill artificial lakes. The marble of the main hall was polished to such a shine that it reflected the sky above it, and at the heart of the complex stood a pavilion made of cane, bamboo, in our language, lacquered and gilded with silk, so constructed that it could be assembled and disassembled and moved like a thought. Marco wrote of this with something close to reverence, and centuries later, a British poet named Samuel Taylor Coleridge would read Marco's description in a fever dream and wake up with a poem already forming. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan establish the decree, and the image would pass into the English imagination as one of its foundational visions of the East, a vision built on Marco's words that were imprecise, second-hand in some details, filtered through language and memory and particular quality of wonder that belongs to a 21-year-old who has been walking for 3 years and has suddenly arrived somewhere that makes the walking worthwhile. Kublai Khan received them warmly. This we know. Niccolo and Ma visited before, and the Khan had sent them back to Europe with a request: bring him 100 Christian scholars, bring him oil from the lamp that burned at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The scholars never came. The Pope sent 2 Dominican friars, who turned back when the road grew difficult. But the oil arrived, and with it, young Marco. The Khan was in his 60s by then, descended from Genghis, heir to the largest contiguous empire in human history, ruler of China under the name of the Yuan dynasty. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men who had ever lived, and he seems to have found Marco genuinely interesting. Marco, for his part, was useful. He spoke languages. He had learned Persian on the road, the lingua franca of the Silk Road, and he picked up enough of the Mongol tongue and the Chinese dialects to make himself understood. He was observant. He had, in the merchant's tradition of his family, the habit of noting details that others might overlook. What things cost, how many days between cities, what crops grew in which soil, what the people ate and how they prayed and what they feared. The Khan put these skills to use. Marco served as an imperial emissary, traveling throughout China and parts of Southeast Asia on missions for the court. He governed the city of Yangzhou for 3 years, according to his own account, though Chinese records do not confirm this, which is one of the points his critics would later seize upon. He traveled to Burma, to what is now Vietnam, to the edges of the Khan's empire, where the jungle began and the maps ended. He saw things. He saw the paper money of the Mongol Empire, printed on bark and backed by the authority of the Khan, a concept so alien to European thinking, where value was measured in gold and silver, that when he described it, his readers in Venice decided he was inventing. But he was not inventing. Paper money was real. It had been in use in China for centuries. The fact that Europeans had not imagined it did not make it imaginary. He saw coal, black, pulled from the earth and burned for heat. Europe knew nothing of coal in the 13th century. When Marco described it, the description seemed possible. Rocks that burned, he he must be lying. He was not lying. He described Estos, which he had encountered somewhere in Central Asia, as the fiber from a salamander, a mythical creature believed to be immune to fire. This was a mistake. The mistake had been circulating in European ship for centuries before Marco arrived. He simply repeated it. He had seen the fiber. He knew it did not burn. He explained it the way his education had equipped him to explain it. He was wrong. He was wrong in the way that all people are wrong, when the knowledge available to them is insufficient. He described the rhinoceros of Southeast Asia and called it a unicorn, not because he was inventing a fairy tale, but as the horn on a rhinoceros's nose and the horn on the legend unicorn were connected in his mind, and the creature before him was the closest thing to a unicorn that had ever existed. He described it as an ugly, thick-skinned, mud-loving beast, nothing like the elegant white horse of legend. He was giving an accurate description. He was using an inaccurate name. These distinctions matter. They are the difference between a liar and a man navigating the impossible task of translating one world for another. 17 years passed. Marco served the Khan, traveled the empire, accumulated observations in the ledger of his memory. He was, by any account, enormously successful. He was rich. He was trusted. He was in a strange way at home. And yet Venice was always there. The canals, the cold morning light, the sound of Italian, his language, the language of his childhood, must have lived somewhere in his chest like a low, persistent ache. He could not return easily. The Khan was not eager to release his useful emissary. It was only in 1292, when a Mongol princess needed escorting by sea to Persia for a political marriage, that the Khan finally permitted Marco, his father, and his uncle to leave. They set sail with a fleet of 14 ships and 600 passengers. 2 years at sea. The journey home was as brutal as the journey out. When they reached Persia, they learned the Khan was dead. When they finally arrived in Venice in 295, they had been gone 24 years. They were middle-aged men in Mongol clothing, barely recognizable, speaking Venetian with an accent salted by decades of Persian and Chinese and the rolling consonants of the steppe. According to one account, perhaps apocryphal, almost certainly embellished, their own family did not recognize them until they slit open the seams of their Mongol robes and out poured a cascade of rubies, emeralds, and sapphires they had sewn into the lining for the journey home. Even the homecoming was a story too good to be entirely true. Venice went to war with Genoa 3 years after Marco returned. This was not unusual, and Genoa had been at war for most of the previous century, competing for the trade routes of the Mediterranean with the focused hostility of two entities that understand each other completely. Marco, now a wealthy merchant, apparently commanded a galley. In 298, his ship was captured. He was taken to Genoa as a prisoner of war. In the prison in Genoa, Marco met a man named Rustichello of Pisa. Rustichello was a writer of romances, the popular literature of the medieval world, stories of knights and quests and impossible loves, written in the Franco-Italian dialect that circulated among the literate classes of northern Italy and southern France. He was not a scholar. He was not a historian. He was a storyteller in the professional sense, which meant he understood what made people keep reading, what rhythms sustained attention across a long winter evening, what details lodged in memory and which ones slid away. Marco had his notes. He had, somehow, preserved materials he had gathered during his years in the Khan's service. Observations, measurements, descriptions, the meticulous data collection of a man trained by merchants to notice everything. He dictated. Rustichello wrote and shaped and occasionally embellished. This collaboration is the second part of the answer to why Marco Polo lied. Rustichello brought to the book the conventions of medieval romance. He described Marco using the heroic formulas of the genre: the brave traveler, the wise informant to powerful rulers, the man who had seen wonders and survived impossible distances. Some of the grandeur in the prose is Rustichello's gift to the narrative, not Marco's own voice. Some of the exaggerations may be Rustichello's professional instinct for what made a better story. The two men's contributions are almost impossible to separate now, because the original manuscript is lost and all we have are copies of copies, translated and retranslated, each version accumulating the small distortions of transmission like sediment building on a riverbed. When they finished, Marco was released as part of peace treaty. He returned to Venice, married, had 3 daughters, and lived comfortably until his death around 1824. He does not appear to have been troubled in his later years by questions of his credibility. He was asked on his deathbed to recant the more extraordinary claims in his book. He refused. He said he had not told half of what he had seen because he feared he would not be believed. That sentence has traveled through 7 centuries, and it still carries weight. I have not told half of what I saw, because I would not have been believed. It is the statement of a man who has spent 26 years watching people decide that reality is less real than their expectations. Let us spend some time with the specific things Marco Polo got wrong, because the shape of his errors is more interesting than the errors themselves. He did not mention the Great Wall of China. This is perhaps the most cited omission in the history of travel writing, and scholars have argued about it for centuries. The most likely explanation is that the Great Wall as we imagine it today, the continuous, tourist-tographed, dramatically crenellated structure that runs along the northern edge of China, is largely a Ming Dynasty construction, built in the 14th and 15th centuries, after Marco had already come and gone. The wall that existed in Marco's time was older, in some places ruined, in some places simply earthen embankments rather than stone, not the wonder it would later become. He may have seen fortifications without recognizing them as part of a singular structure. He may have traveled routes that bypassed the most intact sections. He may have omitted it for the same reason he omitted many things. He was writing about the Mongol Empire, not the remnants of the Chinese structures the Mongols had conquered. The Great Wall, to a Mongol ruler, was a symbol of an enemy's failure to stop them. It was not a landmark Marco's patrons would have found worth celebrating. He did not mention chopsticks, or tea, or the practice of foot binding. These are the cultural details that feel, to modern readers, like obvious things he should have noticed. Some scholars have used these omissions to argue that he never went to China at all, that his entire account is a fabrication assembled from the reports of other travelers. This theory surfaces periodically and is regularly deflated by the weight of the corroborating evidence. The accuracy of his geographical descriptions, the administrative details that match Chinese records, the monetary systems and administrative procedures he described that were only verifiable centuries later when fuller historical records emerged from the Mongol period. The more persuasive explanation for the omissions is simpler and sadder. Marco was writing for Europeans. He mentioned things that would seem valuable, strange, or useful to a European audience. He mentioned the wealth of cities, the organization of postal systems, the prices of spices, the military power of the Mongol armies. He was, at heart, a merchant's son writing a merchant's book. Tea was the ordinary daily drink of the country, not worth remarking upon, like a medieval Chinese traveler visiting France, who might not bother to mention that the people drank wine, because of course they drank wine. What else would people drink? Chopsticks were utensils. What traveler catalogues the eating utensils of every country they passed through? The foot binding is harder to explain. It was widespread, it was visually striking, It produced a way of walking unlike anything Marco would have seen in Europe. But Marco traveled in Mongol circles, at the Mongol court, as an emissary of Mongol power. Mongol women did not bind their feet. The practice was Han Chinese. Marco's world within China was largely the world of the conquerors, and the conquered population may have been less visible to him than we assume. This does not make him a fraud. It makes him a man with a specific vantage point, a specific social position, and a specific audience. All travel writing is an act of selection. All acts of selection involve leaving things out. The question is never whether a traveler tells the whole truth, because no one ever tells the whole truth. The question is what their particular editing reveals about who they were and what they were trying to do. What Marco was trying to do was create a useful picture of the East for a West that had no picture at all. In that, he succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. For 2 centuries after his death, his book was the primary European source of geographical information about Central Asia, China, and the Far East. Christopher Columbus carried a copy of El Million with him when he sailed west toward what he hoped was China. His copy survives. It is full of his handwritten marginal notes. Columbus annotating Marco, the New World dreamed along the margins of a Venetian merchant's memories. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to people who have gone very far and come back. Marco Polo carried it for the rest of his life. The problem is not just that others don't believe you. The problem is that you no longer fit inside the life you left. The scale has changed. You have stood on the roof of the world and felt the air thinning towards something that seemed almost like the edge of the atmosphere itself. You have eaten at the table of the man who owned more of the earth than anyone in human history. You have sailed through storms in the South China Sea and watched sailors drown, and survived to sleep badly in foreign ports and dream of canals that smelled like home. And now you are in a Venetian merchant's house. Someone is singing you how many lai it is from Khanbalik to the sea. And you realize that the measurement you're about to give has no meaning here. That lai is a Chinese unit of distance that this person has never heard, that even the act of locating yourself in space requires a translation that doesn't quite work. Marco gave the distances in his book in terms of days of travel, in lai, in leagues and miles. Shifting between systems depending on what he'd learned in what region, creating a kind of geographical Babel that makes his book maddeningly difficult to use as a navigation tool, while being deeply revealing as a psychological document. He measured the world the way the world had measured itself to him, which was not the way Venice measured things. When he was called Il Million, the million, it was not entirely a compliment. The name apparently came from his habit, when telling stories, of describing things in enormous quantities. Millions of people in this city. Millions of soldiers in that army. Millions of strings of cash in the Khan's treasury. To his contemporaries, the millions were evidence of exaggeration. To modern historians who have access to census records and administrative documents from the Yuan dynasty, the millions are often roughly correct. China in the 13th century had a population of somewhere between 60 and 100 million people. The armies of the Mongol Empire were, by contemporary standards, genuinely vast. The treasury of the Khan genuinely contained wealth, would have been incomprehensible to a Venetian. Marco was not exaggerating, he was reporting. The problem was that the truth exceeded what his audience could absorb. This is a particular kind of tragedy. It happens to anyone who comes from a small world into a large one, and then tries to carry the large one back. The world you left doesn't have the containers. You pour in what you've seen, it overflows. And they look at the flood and say, you must be lying, because the alternative, that the world is genuinely that much larger, that much stranger, that much more populated and wealthy, and various than they had imagined. is somehow more threatening than the comfortable explanation that you have simply made it up. Marco's Venice was a city of roughly 100,000 people, which was large for Europe at the time. The city of Kansai, we now call Hangzhou, had a population by Marco's estimation of at least 1.5 million. The city's markets sold fish and game and spices in quantities that would have supplied Venice for a year in a single day's trade. The streets were paved, the canals were clean, the pleasure gardens were lit at night. When Marco tried to explain it, he reached for the word magnifico so many times that a modern reader can feel the strain. The word not quite large enough, deployed again and again like a hammer hitting a nail that will not go in. He was not lying. He was failing, generously and persistently, at an impossible task. Marco Polo died in Venice in 1324, at approximately 70 years of age, which was a long life for the medieval world. He left behind his 3 daughters, his estate, a Mongol servant named Peter who had traveled west with him and whom he freed in his will, and his book. The book survived. It survived in over 150 manuscript copies in dozens of languages: Latin, French, Italian, German, Czech, each copy subtly different from the others, each translator making choices about what to include and what to soften and what to amplify. The text became a kind of palimpsest of European desires. Every generation rewrote Marco slightly to confirm what it most wanted to believe about the East. The book shaped the world. This is not metaphor. Columbus used it. Henry the Navigator used it. The merchants and monarchs who funded the age of exploration used it. The image of a wealthy, sophisticated, reachable Asia that hung in the European imagination for 2 centuries after Marco's death and drove European ships west and east and south in search of a faster route to the spices and silks and wonder. That image was substantially Marco's. That the China Columbus found was actually a continent he hadn't expected. That the sea route to Asia proved longer and more punishing than anyone had hoped. That the age of exploration turned on the specific error of underestimating the Earth's circumference. None of this was Marco's fault. He had described where the wealth was. He had not claimed there was no ocean between them and it. The question of whether Marco Polo lied is, in the end, a question about what we mean by lying. If lying means conscious deception, deliberate invention offered as truth, then the evidence for it is thin. The things he got wrong are, with some exceptions, the kinds of things that people get wrong when they are working from memory, from second-hand accounts, from the limitations of a vocabulary, from the structural impossibility of making one world legible to another. If lying means choosing which truths to tell and which to omit, if it means editing reality in the service of a narrative, shaping raw experience into a story that can be transmitted and absorbed, then Marco Polo was lying in the same way that every writer, every traveler, every person who has ever tried to explain one place to someone who has never been there is lying. Which is to say, inevitably, imperfectly, and with the best of intentions. The strange thing is that the people who called him a liar were often wrong about the specifics. The paper money was real. The coal was real. The population figures were approximately right. The postal system of the Mongols was genuinely as efficient and extensive as he described. The wealth of the Khan's court was genuine. The magnificence of Kansai was genuine. The things that seemed most impossible turned out, in case after case, to be accurate. And the things that were wrong, the rhinoceros unicorn, the salamander asbestos, the borrowed stories filed smooth, by repetition, were wrong in the ways that all human knowing is wrong. At the edges where certainty gives way to approximation, where the name we have doesn't fit the thing we're naming, where the light is too far away to be sure of what we're seeing. The road from Venice to the Khan's court was roughly 8,000 miles. Marco walked and rode and sailed it twice. He spent roughly 3 years in each direction and 17 years in between. He was young when he left and middle-aged when he returned. And the man who came back was not the same as the boy who left. The boy who had never seen a mountain higher than the Alps, who had never heard a language naced in Latin, who had never tasted the particular sweetness of the lychee fruit or watched fireflies in a Chinese summer garden or stood at the edge of the known world and looked out. We do not know what Marco dreamed about in his last years in Venice. We do not know whether he missed China, whether the sound of Venetian Italian ever seemed thin to him after the full orchestral complexity of Mandarin, whether he woke sometimes in the night with the smell of the steppe in his nostrils, that particular smell of dry grass and horse and immense cold, distance. We do not know if he was happy. We know that when he was dying, he would not take back his words. He said he had not told half of what he had seen. I believe him, not because every word he wrote was accurate. It wasn't. Not because his book is without error or embellishment or the structural distortions of memory and translation. It is not. It is not. Believe him because of the quality of the not-telling that runs beneath his prose. The places where the adjectives give out. The places where he falls back on Magnifico because no other word will do. The moments when you can feel him standing before something so large, so strange, so genuinely unprecedented that the gap between experience and language is not a failure of honesty, but a failure of language itself. And language, unlike the traveler, had not gone where he had gone. He had stood on the roof of the world where fire would not burn and birds could not fly. He had sat at the table of the man who owned half of everything. He had watched the sun set over the South China Sea, from the deck of a ship, in a fleet carrying a princess to a kingdom that had no name in any European tongue. He had lived for 17 years in a world so much larger than the world he was born into. That coming home must have felt, at times, like a kind of shrinking. And he tried to give it to us, imperfectly, through the filters of memory and language and the particular conventions of medieval storytelling, through a collaborator who made it more dramatic and an audience that made it less believable. He tried. The world is larger than we know. It has always been larger than we know. Every traveler who has ever gone far enough to feel that largeness comes back carrying something that cannot be fully translated. A weight of experience that exceeds the words available for it. Marco Polo called it in millione. The million things, the number beyond counting. Let the road fade now. Let the desert cool into silence. Let the mountains lower their peaks into the dark. Let the palaces of the Khan, so bright memory, go dim and quiet, the lanterns guttering one by one along the corridors of marble and silk and gilded cane. Let Marco Polo sleep. He traveled far. He told us what he could, and the world he described, imperfect as the telling was, turned out to be real. The road always ends somewhere. And somewhere, it is enough to have walked it, to have looked, to have tried. However inadequately, however beautifully, to say, I was there. I saw. Here is what it looked like as best as I could tell, from where I stood, with the words I had, in the time I was given. Rest now? The world is wide and strange and largely unmapped. There will be time, in the morning, to wonder about it. For now, let the silence carry you. Let the darkness be kind. Sleep.